Hello, hello, it's Mr. News Anchor Grow, and today we have a special in the history of politics. To explain the past and current developments regarding politics, we have our resident political expert, Mrs. Myers.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Mrs. Myers, can you explain liberalism and conservatism for our audience?
Sure, liberals tend to believe in more government involvement in the economy, but less government in social issues such as reproductive rights. Whereas conservatives believe in less government involvement in the economy through lowering taxes and reduction in spending, with the exception of defense spending. They do, however, see more government involvement in social issues such as limiting abortion, reinstating school prayer, and supporting traditional marriage.
Okay, good to know. So, Democrats are liberals and Republicans are conservatives, right?
Not necessarily. It is possible for someone to be fiscally conservative but socially liberal. If they see marriage equality and pro choice as being more important than lowering taxes, they might be a Democrat. Conversely, if someone is fiscally liberal but opposes abortion, they might be a single issue voter for Republicans.
What do you mean single issue?
For some voters, one specific topic dictates their voting patterns, even if the rest of the platform of that person or party goes against their beliefs. For example, there are some for whom most things you would consider them to be liberal, yet they vote for a candidate who's pro-life because they are strongly opposed to abortion.
Okay, that makes sense.
And let's be honest, today there are more registered independents than either Republicans or Democrats. These are what we call swing voters. And the Republicans of the early 1900s would have been classified as liberals, while the Democrats of the late 1800s would have been conservatives. So you can see these labels are not as easy as we would like them to be.
Got it. So, to my knowledge, modern liberalism began with the New Deal, which we've talked all about, and evolved from there.
Yes, from the 1930s and the New Deal to the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, liberal policies have expanded the social welfare system and tried to help the poor, the elderly, and many others. Liberalism dominated much of the middle of the 1900s.
When did modern conservatism begin?
Well, you could trace it to 1964 when Barry Goldwater from Arizona ran for president. He wrote a book called The Conscience of a Conservative, advocating for personal responsibility, protection of individual freedom, and limited government. He really criticized members of both parties for not doing these, and he campaigned against the welfare state created by the New Deal. In fact, young conservatives joined him and helped to reshape the Republican Party. If you think back to Lyndon Johnson's famous Daisy ad, the one where he has the little girl who's picking the daisy petals and ultimately it ends up in a nuclear weapon, nuclear bomb going off. He was painted as an extremist who would launch a nuclear war, and that one ad, even though it aired only one time, really helped LBJ. And although Goldwater lost, his campaign showed that a conservative could win in the presidency.
So, how did his loss impact the trajectory of the Republican Party?
So let's move on to the 1968 election. And the context is the Vietnam War. You have the rise of counterculture and the new left. You also have a lot of the civil rights movement going on. And people are seeing images of all of these bodies coming home from Vietnam and they start singing, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Well, Nixon's going to run as a Republican against a fractured Democratic Party because not only did LBJ decide not to run again, but the leading contender was Robert Kennedy, and he was assassinated on the day of the California primary, leaving a huge vacuum in who would take up the Democratic mantle. He then used the Southern strategy to bring in Southern voters who had previously voted for the Democrats, even though they really weren't Democratic in their values and the way that they felt. And he pointed that out to them. And as a side note, George Wallace was running from the South, from Alabama, as a segregationist for president. And so Nixon needed a way to take votes away from him. He also talked to individuals and said, "I know you're part of the silent majority. You're not protesters. You're not part of the counterculture. And I know that you're really concerned over the fact that the Supreme Court has made a lot of decisions. I also support a campaign for law and order." And he talked to them about this, about, the majority of people aren't the ones out there that are being vocal and loud. And I hear you and I want to help you. And he really, you can boil it down to a reaction against big government, Great Society, the New Deal, big taxes, but also a desire for states' rights because of the Southern states, particularly wanting to do what they wanted as far as civil rights and not what the government told them to do.
So, Mrs. Myers, if you were to boil down the causes of modern conservatism, or at least the rise of modern conservatism, into a few sentences, how would you put it?
Okay, so one is opposition to activism and really social change in general. So you have the Equal Rights Amendment, women are beginning to work in larger numbers. You have the anti war movement, the rise of feminism, the sexual revolution. all these different civil rights movements going on, the loss of traditional values. And he the conservatism is a response to that of, whoa, let's slow down a little. In addition, they thought that the Supreme Court was being too activist and not really doing what their stated purpose was, instead actually making law instead of just interpreting it and deciding if it was constitutional. Plus, there were concerns over the economy. It had continued to have inflation and things just weren't going so well. There was the failure of foreign policy that, if you look at, we had the Iran hostage crisis, there was the Vietnam War going on, the invasion of Afghanistan. And then finally, you had the suburbs growing, which led to white flight out of the cities and the rise of crime that was perceived in the downtown areas.
So, why is 1980 the year where historians mark the rise of conservatism to have begun?
Well, that's the year that you have Reagan versus Carter. And Reagan had been a Democrat, actually, and big fan of FDR, but he became more conservative starting in 1962. He was an actor, a two-term governor of California, and really a great communicator. In fact, he was known as the great communicator, and he had a way with words. And he attacked the idea of big government, saying government is the big problem and get them out of your lives and you'll be happier. He also attacked the loss of prestige that we'd had from abroad. And so it worked. And not only did he win in a landslide, but for the first time since 1954, Republicans controlled the Senate.
So, what made that possible?
You had two groups that came together called the Conservative Coalition, which maybe wouldn't have voted together before. And they were able to mobilize their voter turnout through mailing lists and all kinds of things. And you had the social conservatives that were called the moral majority, who wanted to restore school prayer, increase defense spending. And then you also had the new right, who were more political, and they were looking at tax cuts, less government, and reducing spending, but also wanted a strong national defense. So they had that in common.
During all of this, what was happening to the Democrats or liberals?
Well, Democrats had had control of the presidency for all but 16 years from 1933 to 1980. So that means that 31 years saw a Democrat in the presidency out of that time period. And even Eisenhower, who was a Republican, had adopted some liberal policies, including Social Security. And that's why the historical focus is on the rise of conservatism, because honestly, it hadn't been as prominent as you might see today.
Now, I know part of the conservative movement is all about lower taxes. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. In 1985, an organization was created called Americans for Tax Reform. It was created by a man named Grover Norquist, and it promoted the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, which basically said if you're running for office and you want to run on the Republican ticket, then you have to oppose all tax increases of any kind. So, in fact, in 2012, 95% of Republican members who belonged to Congress had signed this pledge.
So, the fact that Bush had to increase taxes is why he was a one term president?
Yes, after 12 years of having the presidency from Reagan and Bush, the Republicans lost to Bill Clinton. He came in and talked as a Democrat about reducing big government, which was a shift. He also is the only president in modern history to leave a budget surplus, so he was more of a conservative Democrat.
Speaking of the 1990s, I heard about the role that Newt Gingrich played in 1994. What happened with that?
Well, it was the midterm elections, and Democrats controlled the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And Newt Gingrich came up with this idea for Contract with America. It was a 10-point proposal that would have included budget amendments, tax cuts, and welfare reform. And it worked because the Republicans in the House gained 52 seats, assumed the majority of the House for the first time since 1953. They also got 12 governorships and 20 state legislatures.
I've heard about the Tea Party. Is that a separate party or part of the Republican Party?
It's part of the Republican Party, and it started in 2009 with a taxpayer march on Washington. And they patterned themselves after the American Revolution and the idea of the Tea Party that comes from that point. And the reason that they came together was because of the Bush and Obama bailouts. And we'll talk about that in a different episode. But the idea that here were the president spending and the government spending millions of dollars, billions, in fact, to bail out the auto industry and banks, and they didn't like that at all. And so they ran on a platform of reducing the national debt and government spending, lowering taxes, and opposition to universal health care. And 2010 was the first time we saw a Tea Party candidate elected, and the GOP won big in the midterm elections.
I see. Are there other subgroups? What about within the Democratic Party?
Well, before I get to the Democratic Party, let me talk about what happened with the Republicans. In 2008, John McCain, who was a war hero, very popular in the party, he was a moderate, and he chose Sarah Palin, who was more to the right, as a nod to the Tea Party. Well, it backfired, and he lost. So after that, they kind of did some soul searching, and in 2012, a more moderate by the name of Mitt Romney ran. He was seen as too moderate, so he brought in Paul Ryan, who was a Tea Party member, as his vice president. Well, at that time, Ryan seemed way too far to the right, and it ended up hurting Romney. By the way, on a side note, today Romney is being booed from his own party, but has shifted more to his right. In 2014, there was a battle between the Tea Party and what was seen as establishment candidates. In fact, Eric Cantor, who was the House Majority Leader, so he was really the number two guy in the House because the number one was the Speaker of the House. He was primaried because he wasn't a Tea Partier and he was ousted even though he was Republican leadership. Then in 2015, the House Freedom Caucus was created, and there currently exists today out of 435 members. There are 30 who identify as Freedom Caucus members, including Matt Gaetz and Jim Jordan. They are more to the far right leaning, maybe even bordering on libertarian. Sometimes they even fight against Republican bills because limited government is really the big thing that they are about. And some Tea Party senators whose names you may recognize include Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Rand Paul, who have all run for president. Well, getting back to 2016, there is a Democratic rift, and that really emerges between Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders. And that's where you see the establishment again, but in this case versus the populist wing of the Democratic Party. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute.
So, what factors led to President Trump's election in 2016? He had been a Democrat before, correct?
Yeah, he had been a Democrat, and he had even donated money to Hillary Clinton's New York Senate campaign multiple times from 2002 to 2007. But what happened was Americans were hungry for a new brand of politics. You can see this by support of President Trump and Bernie Sanders, because both of them were populists in different ways. And he capitalized on decades of people feeling ignored by the government, that it didn't really care about them, the perceived corruption that was going on in Washington, and a desire to break the system. And if they could break it, then maybe they could rebuild it to better help the average person. And then also he capitalized on the fears that many Americans had about globalization. The platform that he ran on was immigration restrictions, repealing and replacing Obamacare, and an American first foreign policy and trade. And it worked because in 2016, Republicans controlled the executive and both houses of the legislative branch.
It sounds like the Republican Party is changing.
Yes, traditional conservatism since the 1920s, at least, has been about lowering taxes, which everyone in the Republican Party agrees with, free trade, and lowering the national debt. Establishment Republicans like Mitt Romney still follow all of these, while other Republicans, plus newer members, are now opposed to free trade. And under the Trump administration, both lowered taxes and increased spending, which added to the national debt. There are primaries happening too. Unlike the Tea Party ouster of Eric Cantor that was largely about policy, this one is more about loyalty, as we see what's happening with Liz Cheney.
Wait, Liz Cheney, daughter of former Republican Vice President Dick Cheney?
Yes, she is as conservative as they come, but she voted to impeach President Trump, and so the Republican Party just voted her out of her leadership role. Right now, there seems to be some soul searching for the direction of the party, as well as where it lies with its traditional values. And we can see that through 2018, the Republicans lost the House. In 2020, they lost the presidency. And in 2021, they lost the Senate. And what would have happened in previous years, and maybe happening today, is that they would do postmortems. Really, let's examine why we lost an election. And both Republicans and Democrats have done that to see where can we make changes so that we can do better the next time.
Now, I know the Democrats have also had some growing divisions. Where are they currently?
Well, 2016 was rough for them. There was a splinter over Clinton, who was the establishment favorite, and Bernie Sanders, who was accused the party of funny business in helping Clinton win the nomination. Things were not good because they lost the presidency, the House, and the Senate. So they did one of those postmortems to see where they went wrong, and the party did actually make some changes to the nomination process as a result of the criticisms that Bernie had had. Now we have more new progressive members, including the Squad, who have come into the Democratic Party, and they're very outspoken against the establishment and big money. Think of people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, known as AOC. Well, 2020 saw the most diverse group of candidates ever, but in the end, they coalesced around a moderate, experienced politician. And the party seems unified for now. 94% of Democrats approve of Biden right now as president. And progressives and moderates alike both seem happy.
Well, all these developments are certainly going to be interesting to watch.
Yes. As we have seen before in history, both the Republican and Democratic parties have changed over time. Let's look at the GOP specifically, the Republicans. In the early days, they were the party of anti-slavery, big government during the Civil War, and taxation. Then in the early 1900s, they were a very progressive party, going after big business, looking at workers' rights, and making bold changes in society. It was in the 1920s that they began to be pro-business, lower taxes, lower regulations. During the middle part of the 1900s, there was the vital center where leaders drew honestly from the best of both parties. So now we maybe will witnessing another metamorphosis of the political system. While the Democrats have been fairly steady in beliefs since the 1913 election of Woodrow Wilson, with the exception of the Southern Dixiecrats that Nixon helped to flip to the Republicans in 1968, the future is unwritten and we will just have to see.
Well, thank you so much for coming in, Mrs. Myers. This has been incredibly informative, and I hope our audience now has the background information necessary to follow these political developments as active participants in our democracy. That's all for today's show. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.